The night was already burning when the Iranian ambassador walked into that room. Not the kind of burning you see on a map, not the kind you read about in a headline, the kind you feel in your chest. That heavy electric weight of a moment that has been building for decades, through wars fought in the shadows, through proxy battles that never carried anyone's official name, through broken truces and fragile handshakes that everyone knew were never going to hold forever. That kind of burning. The kind that lives in the silence between two men sitting across a table from each other when both of them know exactly what the other one is thinking. And neither one is going to say it directly because they don't have to, because the explosion said it for them the night before. In that meeting room inside the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Riyadh, on the first day of March 2026, all of it, every wound, every unspoken grievance, every broken promise and shattered agreement between these two ancient rivals, was sitting right there at the table, invisible. But heavier than anything made of stone, Iran's ambassador to Saudi Arabia, Alireza Enayati, had been summoned. Not invited, not called in for a friendly discussion, not asked to come in and share some tea and talk things over. Summoned. And that single word tells you everything you need to know about the temperature of that room before a single sentence had been spoken. Because being summoned to a foreign ministry is not a conversation. It is a reckoning. To understand why that reckoning happened, you have to go back exactly 24 hours. You have to go back to the morning of Saturday, February 28th, 2026, to understand what lit the fuse that ended with an Iranian ambassador sitting in a Saudi government building, receiving one of the most pointed diplomatic messages the kingdom had ever delivered to Tehran. In the early hours of that Saturday morning, the United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated, wide-ranging military operation against Iran. On the Israeli side, the operation was called Roaring Lion. On the American side, it was designated Operation Epic Fury by the United States Department of Defense. Those names alone tell you something about the intention behind the strikes. These were not pinprick attacks. These were not surgical strikes designed to send a message. This was an all-out assault. The Israeli military later stated it dropped more than 1,200 munitions across 24 of Iran's 31 provinces in a single day. American warships launched Tomahawk cruise missiles. The U.S. Army used HIMARS rocket systems. New low-cost attack drones from a unit called Task Force Scorpion Strike were deployed in combat for the very first time. Airstrikes began around 9:45 in the morning Iranian time on a Saturday, which in Iran is a regular working day, the first day of the week, designed, as Israeli defense officials would later explain, to achieve tactical surprise by striking when senior officials would be gathered together. They called it achieving tactical surprise for the second time, a reference to similar successful operations in their 12-day war with Iran back in June 2025. Among the targets was the Pasteur district of Tehran, the area where Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, was known to reside, home also to the presidential palace and the National Security Council. By the end of those terrible early morning hours, the world received the news that changed everything. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was dead. The man who had led the Islamic Republic of Iran for more than 34 years, who had guided Iran's nuclear program, who had built and sustained the network of allied militias and political movements across the Middle East known as the Axis of Resistance, he was gone. Killed in a joint American-Israeli strike on the capital of the Islamic Republic. The second supreme leader in the history of Iran, dead. And the region would never look the same again. Iran did not grieve quietly. Iran did not wait. Iran did not calculate. Iran struck back with everything it had. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps activated what they called Operation True Promise 4. Within hours of the U.S.-Israeli attack, missiles and drones were flying in every direction across the Middle East. The IRGC issued a statement that left no ambiguity about their intentions. They declared that every single American military asset throughout the region was now a legitimate target. All of it. Every base, every installation, every piece of equipment bearing the American flag. Fair game. And they meant it, because they started hitting everything they could reach. 4 specific U.S. bases were immediately confirmed, targeted by the IRGC. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the largest American military installation in the entire Middle East. Ali Al Salam Air Base in Kuwait, which also hosted Italian Air Force personnel. Al Dhafra Air Base in the UAE, and the U.S. Navy 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain's Jufair district. Those were just the beginning. But Saudi Arabia was not one of those 4 bases. Saudi Arabia was not hosting American strike aircraft. Saudi Arabia had not participated in the U.S.-Israeli operation. In fact, Saudi Arabia had done something remarkable in the days leading up to this crisis. They had explicitly told the Iranian government, through official diplomatic channels, that they would not allow their airspace or their territory to be used to target Iran. They were trying to stay out of it. They were trying to protect themselves from being swallowed by somebody else's war. Saudi Arabia had spent years building a very careful, very deliberate policy of keeping itself out of direct confrontation with Tehran, even while Tehran's allies were firing rockets into Yemen and destabilizing parts of the region where Saudi interests lived. And Iran attacked Saudi Arabia anyway. Missiles hit Riyadh. Missiles hit the eastern province, the region that holds the vast majority of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, the region that the entire world economy depends on for energy stability. Missiles hit Jazan in the south. Saudi air defense systems scrambled into action. The U.S. King Fahd Air Base in Riyadh was targeted. The King Salman headquarters was targeted. Explosions tore through the night sky above the Saudi capital. Residents who had gone to sleep in what they believed was the safest country in the Gulf woke up to sounds that shook their windows and their sense of security simultaneously. People who had moved to Riyadh from Lebanon, from Pakistan, from across Asia, people who had come to the Gulf precisely because it was supposed to be safer than the places they had left, found themselves standing in their apartments listening to air defense systems intercepting missiles overhead. One Lebanese woman living near the U.S. base told journalists what was going through her mind. She said she'd left Lebanon because the Gulf was supposed to be safer than Lebanon. And now, she said, she did not know what to think or how to feel. The Saudi Foreign Ministry confirmed the attacks quickly and officially. They stated clearly that Iran had targeted Riyadh and the eastern province, and that the attacks had been repelled. The kingdom's air defenses had intercepted all incoming missiles aimed at its territory. No civilian casualties were officially reported in Saudi Arabia. But then came the statement that told you exactly where this was heading. The Saudi Foreign Ministry called the Iranian attacks blatant. It called them cowardly. It said the attacks cannot be justified or accepted under any pretext in any way. It condemned them in the strongest possible terms. And then it said, and this is the sentence that carried all the weight, it said, Saudi Arabia will take all necessary measures to defend its security and protect its territory, citizens, and residents, including with the option of responding to the aggression. Read that again slowly. Saudi Arabia, one of the most strategically cautious countries in the world, a kingdom that had spent years avoiding direct confrontation with Iran, even when its proxies were attacking Saudi-backed forces in Yemen, was now saying publicly that responding militarily to Iranian aggression was an option on the table. That is not language used lightly. That is not diplomatic boilerplate. That is a country that has been attacked on its own soil, on its own capital, on the infrastructure that underpins its entire economy and its entire Vision 2030 future, and is telling the world that it reserves the right to do something about it. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman personally picked up the phone that night and called the leaders of 5 countries, the UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, and Jordan. He told each of them directly that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia stood in full solidarity alongside them. He told each of them that Saudi Arabia was ready to place all of its capabilities at their disposal. 6 leaders, 1 chain of phone calls, in a single night of crisis, and then came Sunday morning, March 1st, 2026, and with it, the summons. The Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued its instruction. Iranian Ambassador Alireza Enayati was to present himself at the ministry. He was to come in. And when he arrived, the man waiting for him on behalf of the kingdom was Saudi Deputy Foreign Minister Walid bin Abdul Karim al-Qurayji. This was not a diplomatic pleasantry. This was not a routine check-in. This was one sovereign country formally delivering its position to another, face to face, through the man who represented that other country on Saudi soil. Al-Qurayji conveyed Saudi Arabia's strong condemnation and denunciation of the attacks. He expressed the kingdom's anger. He made clear Saudi Arabia's absolute rejection of any violation of state sovereignty. He stressed that these aggressive actions undermine regional security and stability efforts and push the region, his exact words, toward a dark tunnel of chaos. And he stated the kingdom's position on what comes next. Saudi Arabia will take all necessary measures to defend its security and protect its territory. That phrase, all necessary measures, is not standard diplomatic language. In the world of foreign ministries and formal communiques, where every single word is weighed and chosen with extraordinary precision before it ever leaves the building, phrases like that carry enormous and unmistakable meaning. They are the language countries use when they are telling you that they have not yet decided what they are going to do, but that they have not ruled anything out. They are the language of a door left deliberately, dangerously open. Kuwait was doing exactly the same thing at exactly the same time. Qatar was doing the same. Other Gulf states followed. A wave of Iranian ambassadors being called in across the region on the same morning, receiving versions of the same message. You attacked us on our own soil, and we are not going to pretend that is acceptable. But Saudi Arabia's summons carried a weight that the others did not quite carry. Because Saudi Arabia is not just another Gulf state. Saudi Arabia is the largest economy in the Arab world. It is the custodian of Mecca and Medina, the 2 holiest sites in all of Islam. It produces enough oil that its eastern province, the exact region that Iranian missiles had targeted, can move global energy markets by itself. When Saudi Arabia speaks with this kind of language, the entire world stops to listen in a way it simply does not always do for others. Now, to truly feel the magnitude of that confrontation, to feel the full electricity of what was actually happening in that room, you have to go much further back. You have to understand who these two countries are to each other at the deepest level and how they arrived at this particular moment in this particular building on this particular morning. Saudi Arabia and Iran are not ordinary rivals. They are the two most powerful countries in the Muslim world, separated by a narrow strip of water and divided by something infinitely wider. Centuries of religious difference, competing visions of what Islam means, what leadership looks like, who speaks for the faith, and who exploits it. Saudi Arabia sees itself as the guardian of Sunni Islam and the protector of its holiest sites. Iran, since its revolution in 1979, rebuilt itself as the champion of Shia Islam and the revolutionary voice that challenges every monarchy, every Western-aligned government in the region, including the House of Saud. From the very first days after the Iranian Revolution, these two countries were on a collision course. The only question was always how violent the collision would eventually be. Through the 1980s, they competed during Iran's bloody war against Iraq, when Saudi Arabia backed Saddam Hussein financially. In 1987, Iranian authorities organized pilgrim demonstrations in Mecca that turned violent, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of pilgrims, deeply scarring the relationship. In 2015, during the Hajj pilgrimage, a crowd crush in Mina killed over 1,000 people, including nearly 500 Iranians, and each side blamed the other for negligence. By 2016, after Saudi Arabia executed prominent Shia cleric Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, Iranian protesters stormed the Saudi embassy in Tehran and the Saudi consulate in Mashhad, setting fire to both. Saudi Arabia severed all diplomatic ties with Iran that same week, and they stayed severed for 7 full years. 7 years of no official communication, no ambassadors, no embassies, no direct contact. Between two countries that share one of the most critical bodies of water in the entire world, that both need the Gulf to be stable in order to sell their oil, that both have millions of people whose daily lives depend on regional peace. 7 years, during which Iran and Saudi Arabia continued their proxy competition in Yemen, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Iraq, fighting each other's allies with weapons and money and intelligence, never directly, always through other people's bodies. And then, something remarkable happened. In March 2023, after years of quiet negotiations hosted by Iraq and Oman, the two sides finally agreed to sit down properly and try to end it. The final breakthrough came in Beijing, brokered not by the United States, not by Europe, but by China, by Beijing, which had carefully positioned itself as an honest broker with credibility on both sides. China had major economic interests in Iranian oil and in Saudi investment. China had no military alliances in the Gulf. China had no old wounds with either side. And so, from March 6th to March 10th, 2023, senior officials from Iran and Saudi Arabia met in the Chinese capital. Iran's Rear Admiral Ali Shamkhani, head of the Supreme National Security Council, and Saudi Arabia's National Security Advisor, Mossad bin Mohammed al-Ayban, sat across from Chinese mediators and worked out the terms of a historic agreement. They agreed to resume full diplomatic relations. They agreed to reopen each other's embassies within 2 months. They agreed to reactivate a 1998 cooperation agreement and a 2001 security agreement that had both been suspended for years. The deal sent shockwaves around the world, not only because of what it meant for the Gulf, but because of what it said about the changing geography of global power. The United States had not been in the room. The agreement that the world had assumed only Washington could broker was brokered by Beijing. Something had shifted. Iran reopened its embassy in Riyadh in June 2023. Saudi Arabia reopened its embassy in Tehran in August 2023, and in September 2023, Iran's new ambassador arrived in Riyadh to begin his posting. His name was Alireza Enayati, the same man who would, 2.5 years later, be summoned to receive Saudi Arabia's furious condemnation after Iranian missiles fell on the Saudi capital. He had arrived as the living symbol of a new beginning. He had spent more than 2 years carefully tending to one of the most fragile and important diplomatic relationships in the world. He had worked to normalize a relationship that both sides genuinely needed to survive. Trade discussions were beginning. Hajj coordination had resumed, with Iran and Saudi Arabia agreeing on increased quotas for Iranian pilgrims and improved management for the 2026 season. High-level phone calls had happened. Iranian President Raisi had traveled to Riyadh to attend an Arab League summit on Gaza, the first Iranian president to visit Saudi Arabia in over a decade. Things were fragile, but they were moving in a direction that everyone on both sides preferred to the alternative. And then February 28th happened. And all of it, all the careful work, all the quiet diplomacy, all the small wins and the slow rebuilding, suddenly had to survive an earthquake. The scale of what Iran did on that day and the days immediately following was staggering, even by the standards of a region that has seen a great deal of staggering things. In Bahrain, Iranian drones and shrapnel hit residential buildings in the capital Manama. The U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters in the Jaffa area was directly targeted. Smoke and fire rose from high-rise buildings. Bahrain's Ministry of Interior confirmed damage to multiple buildings across Manama and Muharraq. The U.S. Embassy in Bahrain announced it would close the following day. Schools and universities were told to switch to distance learning until further notice. In Kuwait, a missile attack caused what Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani described as significant damage to the runway at Ali Al Salam Air Base. A drone targeted Kuwait International Airport. Kuwaiti air defense systems intercepted it, but not before it had already terrified a city that was supposed to be at peace. In Qatar, the Al Udeid Air Base, the home of CENTCOM, the U.S. military's central command for the entire Middle East, was hit by missiles. Doha shook. AFP journalists on the ground watched one incoming missile destroyed in a puff of white smoke by Qatari Patriot defense systems. Another AFP journalist watched a volley of Patriot interceptors launching from the ground to meet incoming threats. But the city still shook. Qatar counted 44 incoming missiles and 8 drones on the first day alone. In the UAE, the numbers were even more overwhelming. Iran launched 165 ballistic missiles and 541 drones at the Emirates. Emirati air defenses destroyed 152 of the missiles and 506 of the drones. But 13 missiles reached the sea, and some debris fell. 3 people were killed. A Pakistani national died near Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi. Another person of Asian origin was killed by falling shrapnel in a residential district of the capital. 4 airport staff at Dubai International Airport were injured. 4 more people at Palm Jumeirah were hurt when debris from intercepted missiles started a fire in a building. Dubai, a city that prides itself on being the safest, most cosmopolitan, most welcoming city in the region, a city that has no public bomb shelters because it never thought it needed them, watched parents spend the night with anxious children in underground parking garages. Some told their children the explosions above were Ramadan fireworks. It was Ramadan. That detail was true. Nothing else about that night was ordinary. Meanwhile, the U.S. was taking its own casualties. By Sunday evening, U.S. Central Command released a statement confirming that 3 American soldiers had been killed in action and 5 seriously wounded by Iranian attacks across the region. Several others had sustained minor injuries. Major combat operations continue and our response effort is ongoing, the statement said. And the entire Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply flows every single day, connecting the Gulf's massive oil producers to the rest of the world, was in chaos. Vessels received warnings about the closure of the strait. Ships redirected. Insurance rates spiked. Energy markets shuddered. The whole machinery of the global economy felt the vibration of what was happening in the Gulf. France's Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said the Gulf states had been drawn into a war they did not choose. Germany's Chancellor Friedrich Merz called on Iran to immediately stop its indiscriminate attacks, and simultaneously predicted that the Islamic Republic's era of clerical rule was coming to an end following Khamenei's death, saying his government shared Iranians' relief at the possibility of change, while cautioning that the path ahead was uncertain and dangerous. The UN Secretary-General condemned both the U.S.-Israeli strikes for violating Iran's sovereignty and Iran's retaliatory attacks for violating the sovereignty of 7 different countries. 7 countries named in a single condemnation: Bahrain, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and then there was Oman, the one Gulf state that Iran did not strike. Oman, the quiet mediator. The country that had been hosting the back-channel negotiations between Iran and the United States for months. The country whose Foreign Minister Badr al-Busaidi had been in Geneva just 2 days before the attack, meeting with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, walking out with what he called significant progress. He had said Iran had agreed never to stockpile enriched uranium, calling it a major breakthrough. He had used the word peace and said it was within reach. Hours later, the U.S. and Israel attacked, and those talks died. Al-Busaidi expressed dismay and urged Washington not to get sucked in further. He was calling for a ceasefire while simultaneously watching the Gulf burn around him. Iran's own secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, one of the most powerful surviving figures in the Iranian government after Khamenei's death, vowed to stab America in the heart. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said his country viewed revenge as its legitimate right and duty. Iran was grieving and fighting at the same time, launching wave after wave of missiles and drones, while simultaneously trying to figure out what came next for a government that had just lost the man who had defined it for 34 years, back in Riyadh, back in that room. Alireza Inayati sat across from Walid al-Khureji and received Saudi Arabia's message. Think for a moment about what it means to be that ambassador in that moment. He had come to Riyadh as the symbol of peace. He had spent over 2 years working to build something real and durable out of the fragile Beijing agreement. He had coordinated Hajj logistics. He had watched trade discussions begin. He had been part of something that many people in both countries and around the world genuinely believed could change the nature of the Gulf. And now the government he represented had just fired missiles at the capital city where he lived and worked, at the infrastructure that underpins the country he was accredited to, at the very place where his embassy sat. What does that feel like from the inside of that diplomatic mission? What does it feel like to represent a country that has just done the thing your entire presence was supposed to prevent? There is no clean answer to that question. There is only the reality of being in that room, receiving words that were chosen with surgical precision to communicate exactly how serious the moment was. The Saudi statement after the meeting did not soften anything. The kingdom rejects violations of sovereignty. The kingdom rejects actions that undermine regional stability. These actions push the region toward a dark tunnel of chaos, and the kingdom will take all necessary measures. Saudi Arabia was joined immediately by an international chorus of condemnation. Germany and France both called on Iran to stop its attacks on Gulf states. The Arab League rallied behind its members. The international community watched the delicate 2023 peace framework, the thing that China and Iraq and Oman had all worked so hard to build, suddenly teetering on the edge of collapse. What comes next is the question that the entire region is living with right now. Khamenei is dead, and Iran must find a new supreme leader at the exact moment when it is fighting a war it did not expect to be in. The US and Israel are conducting what they describe as ongoing major combat operations. The Gulf states are counting their missile fragments and asking themselves how long they can remain bystanders before bystander status becomes untenable. Saudi Arabia has said it reserves the option of responding. That option has not been taken off the table. And somewhere in all of this, there is still the ghost of the Beijing agreement, the fragile, necessary thing that two ancient enemies built out of mutual exhaustion and pragmatic need. The détente that gave Alireza Inayati his posting in Riyadh, the peace that nobody believed would survive a shock this large. It has not been formally declared dead. Saudi Arabia has not expelled the Iranian ambassador. Iran has not withdrawn its diplomats. The embassies are still open, technically. The diplomatic channels that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe are still technically functioning. But the night of February 28, 2026, changed what those channels can carry. Because whatever message flows through them now carries the weight of everything that happened above the skies of Riyadh that night. Every future conversation between Saudi Arabia and Iran will have that night somewhere in the background. Every negotiation, every Hajj meeting, every trade discussion. The missiles will be there, invisible, hanging in the air between every exchange. The ambassador came. The message was delivered. The words were chosen with the precision of people who understand exactly what they mean and exactly what they are willing to do. All necessary measures. That phrase sat in the room after the meeting ended. It sat in the communique. It sat in the consciousness of every government in the region reading the Saudi statement and understanding that this was not the end of the confrontation. This was the opening of a new chapter, the terms of which nobody has yet written. Saudi Arabia sent Iran's ambassador a message on that Sunday morning that was both a condemnation and a warning. The warning was delivered politely, formally, professionally, as warnings are delivered between countries that still maintain diplomatic relations. But underneath the diplomatic language, underneath the formal phrasing, underneath the careful words, the message was simple, and it was heavy, and it was the kind of message that changes things. You crossed a line. We told you not to. You knew we had told you, and we will decide what that means. The region held its breath. The ambassador's car pulled away from the ministry. The statement was released to the world, and the Gulf, already burning, waited to see what came next. But let's slow down for a moment, because there is something deeply important hiding inside all of this news, inside all of these missile numbers and diplomatic statements and political declarations, something that often gets lost when the cameras zoom in on the smoke and the air defense systems and the formal communiques. And that thing is the human reality of what is at stake when two of the most powerful countries in the Muslim world confront each other at this level. The Gulf region is home to tens of millions of people who had nothing to do with the decisions made in Tehran or Washington or Tel Aviv on February 28, 2026. Expat workers from Pakistan, from Bangladesh, from Nepal, people who came to Dubai or Riyadh or Abu Dhabi to earn money, to send remittances home, to build something their families could not have back home. They were the ones in underground parking garages in Dubai listening to explosions. They were the ones injured when missile debris fell on residential areas. A Pakistani national died near Zayed International Airport. These are the people who live in the gap between geopolitical decisions and human consequences. The Gulf built itself over the last 5 decades into something extraordinary. Dubai went from a small fishing town to one of the most visited cities on Earth. Riyadh is in the middle of the most ambitious economic transformation in its history under Vision 2030. Qatar hosted a World Cup. All of this was built on a single foundational assumption, that the Gulf is stable, that it is safe, that you can build things there and they will still be standing tomorrow. February 28, 2026, challenged that assumption in a way nothing had challenged it in a very long time. And Saudi Arabia, sitting across from the Iranian ambassador, was not just delivering a message about missile strikes. It was delivering a message about the entire framework on which the modern Gulf is built. We will not allow our territory to become a casualty of other people's wars. We will take all necessary measures. And then there is the nuclear dimension, the issue that was the entire reason the US and Iran were in indirect negotiations in Oman and Geneva in the weeks before the attack. 3 rounds of talks had happened. The third round, in Geneva on February 26th, had shown real progress. Oman's foreign minister had described Iran's agreement never to stockpile enriched uranium as a major breakthrough. The talks were closer to a deal than they had been in years. And then, 48 hours later, everything changed. The Washington Post reported that Trump had been lobbied for weeks by an unusual alliance of Israel and Saudi Arabia, both pushing for military action against Iran. That is a complicated detail that sits behind Saudi Arabia's formal condemnation of Iran's retaliatory strikes. Saudi Arabia may have had a role in encouraging the very chain of events that ended with missiles falling on Riyadh. This is the kind of complexity that makes the Middle East so difficult to understand and so impossible to simplify. Saudi Arabia potentially encouraged the US to strike Iran. Iran retaliated by striking Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia summoned the Iranian ambassador to condemn the retaliation. Every actor in this story is simultaneously a victim and a participant, simultaneously a target and a contributor to the conditions that made targeting possible. And all of them, every government, every diplomat, every ambassador and foreign minister, is now trying to manage a situation that none of them fully control, and that all of them fear could become something much worse than anything that has happened so far. Because here's the truth that the formal statements and the diplomatic language are all trying very hard not to say out loud. Nobody knows how this ends. Khamenei is dead. Iran must find a successor at the same moment it is fighting a war. The US is conducting ongoing major combat operations against a country of 90 million people, with significant military capabilities and motivated proxies across the entire region. Saudi Arabia is sitting on the most valuable energy reserves on Earth, reserves that have just been attacked, and has said it will take all necessary measures. The Strait of Hormuz, through which the world's oil moves, is in a state of disruption. 3 American soldiers are dead. Civilians from Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh are dead, and the fragile Beijing agreement that represented the best hope for a stable Gulf is sitting in a room full of smoke, deciding whether it still wants to survive. The confrontation between Saudi Arabia and Iran's ambassador on March 1st, 2026 was not the beginning of this crisis, and it will not be the end of it. But it was a moment that captured everything. The decades of rivalry, the years of cautious rapprochement, the fragile peace that never quite became stable enough to trust, the geopolitical fault lines that run beneath every government in the region, and the human cost, the cost measured not just in political statements, but in exploded buildings and terrified children and workers who died far from home because missiles fell in the wrong place. The ambassador came. He received the message. He left. Saudi Arabia published its statement. The world read it. And in the phrase all necessary measures, every government in the region heard something slightly different depending on what it feared most. And all of them heard something that made them understand the moment was not over. It was just beginning.